that day, 16 innocent people were murdered, including one American, Alan Beer from Cleveland. And over 100 of us were injured on and off the bus. And I say on and off the bus because people that were half a block and a block away were also injured. And everyone seated and standing around me on the bus did not survive. They said that the terrorist was approximately 2 people standing away from where I was seated, so it was me, then the girl sitting next to me, her boyfriend, and then the terrorist. And they said that it was lucky that I was screaming when I did, because a few minutes after they put me in the ambulance, a small fire broke out in the middle of the bus, and they couldn't tell who was unconscious and who wasn't alive. And so by screaming, I was able to let them know that I was there. I stayed in the hospital for about a week and a half. My dad came, my brother came, my mother's passport had expired, so she didn't initially make the trip, and then I told her I didn't want her coming because I didn't want her first trip to Israel, because she had never been there, to be a remembrance of a hospital bed and the terrorist attack. And so my dad wanted me to come back with him, but I stayed on an extra week after they left because I didn't want to be afraid to come back in September and to go to the places that I went all the time, because where the attack happened was on Yaffo Street in Jerusalem, and I walked there every day. And the bus that I took to work went straight there, and every taxi that I would take would go through there. And I didn't want to be afraid to be able to live life there as normal as possible, as normal as could be expected. But I was allowed out for about an hour a day. I went out for lunch to a cafe one day, I went to the mall, and the last day before I boarded the flight, I went with a friend of mine who I actually ran the summer program with years prior. He's a social worker, and we actually walked from King George Street up Yaffo to exactly where the site, where the attack happened. We talked about it. We said some prayers for the people that didn't survive and the ones that were still in the hospital. And then that night I boarded a flight back to New Jersey, to New York. And 2 weeks later, I ended up on the mission with the Israelis that I had planned the mission for. We spoke in Washington, D.C. at congressional hearings. Congressman Smith had put together a congressional hearing with, at the time, Congressman Lantos, and many different congressional leaders came in and out to hear my stories as well as the Israelis. And I always say that my story represents not only myself, but thousands of people in Israel and people around the world that are directly affected by terrorism. So the Zaka goes, and after the attack, they pick up all the body parts to be buried. And this guy said that he had worked for Zaka for 12 years as a volunteer, and this attack was the worst thing he had ever seen, and afterwards he couldn't go back to work. And he can't concentrate, he has trouble sleeping, his kids are suffering, his wife is suffering. And I was crying. I couldn't believe this, because the last thing I ever thought about was that the first responders are affected by what they're seeing. And the first thing I said, because I was the last person to speak, was, I said to him, I said, thank you for saving our lives. I said, we don't always realize, that the people that are helping us are just as much affected as we are. And I feel terrible, I told him, I said, I feel terrible for your wife, and she was there, and, for your family, for what you're going through, because none of us would ever want, your family to suffer, and, whatever we can do to help your family, we want to be a support system. But I think that's just really important, is to recognize and to understand that everybody's human, and that even first responders can't always handle everything. And it's not to be Superman. You do what you can to help, but don't think that you're immune to what's happening around you. And I thought that was interesting, because at another event where I spoke to first responders, they felt they were all men, but they all felt that they had to be strong, and they couldn't, they didn't want to discuss what they had been through in helping victims. So, I just think that's something really important just to keep in mind when you're helping, that, we don't always recognize it and initially, but at some point, we the victims